Across the wires and through the air, those who seek will find me there. Story, wonder, voice, and art find the ears and find the heart. Welcome, dear listener. You are brave meeting me here at the crossroads, but it's good to see you. This summer on Wishcrafting, you and I are going to New Orleans. Not the postcard version, not the party brochure version. I want to take you deep into the city that I love so much. A place where music spills through open windows at 2 a.m, where storms gather over the Mississippi like living things, where cemeteries are cities of the dead and living memory, where jazz funerals dance beside grief, and where swamp water reflects lantern light and Spanish moss that hangs like ghosts from the trees. Over the next several episodes, we'll wander through graveyards and riverbanks, through crossroad myths, hurricane folklore, and midnight courtyards. But mostly, we're going to talk about the strange way that New Orleans blurs the line between the sacred and the everyday. Because New Orleans is not just a city. It is can you guess? It's a threshold. But it's also a portal. And it is a damn potent one at that. New Orleans is a place that is shaped by water, memory, rhythm, survival, and spirit. And once that spirit gets into you, it tends to stay there. So tonight, we begin where all good stories do, after dark. New Orleans does not feel like the rest of America. The first thing you notice is the air. Not the beautiful buildings, full of color and timeless structure, not the music creeping down the road, not even the river, dark and powerful. But the air. The air is heavy and wet and alive. The humidity wraps around you like a second skin, as the smell of river water, jasmine, cigarettes, rain-soaked brick, old beer, fried food, incense, and something else faintly familiar all rise together into one impossible perfume. And then comes the sound. A trumpet somewhere down the block, glass bottles clinking in a courtyard, laughter spilling out of open windows, the low hum of generators and air conditioners fighting the heat. And just out of sight, the Mississippi River moves nearby like some enormous sleeping thing. New Orleans is a city of thresholds. Land and water, life and death, celebration and grief, luxury and collapse, and Catholic saints next to African spirits. It's no wonder that so many people describe the city as feeling alive in a way that borders on supernatural. And it does feel supernatural there. How could it not with so much history? But New Orleans isn't frozen in the past. Because in New Orleans, the past never fully leaves. To understand New Orleans spiritually, you have to first understand it geographically, because this city should not exist. Or at least, it exists in defiance of nature. New Orleans was built in the curve of the Mississippi River near the Gulf Coast, and it is surrounded by swamps, marshes, bayous, and otherwise waterlogged earth. Much of the city sits at or below sea level, caught between river and lake, constantly negotiating with floodwaters. And water defines everything here. The shape of the streets, the cemeteries, the architecture, the mood, even the relationship that people have with death. And the city has always understood, whether consciously or unconsciously, that nature is not fully under human control here. The Mississippi itself feels mythic when you stand beside it at night. It's wild, it's wide, it's dark, and it's restless. For centuries, the Mississippi River carried goods like cotton, sugar, and other things that brought the colonists wealth. But it also carried diseases, death, and, of course, enslaved people. People that were carrying less tangible things, like their memory, their culture, and their spirits. The river gave New Orleans its depth, all while constantly threatening its destruction. Naturally, living beside something so powerful changes you spiritually, even if it's not overtly acknowledged. Even so, New Orleans has never really had the luxury of believing itself separate from nature. The city sweats, floods, sinks, and rebuilds on a rotation that seemingly never ends. Ultimately, New Orleans had survival built in from the start, and it shows. New Orleans is a French, Spanish, African, Caribbean, indigenous, Catholic, Creole, Southern, Haitian riverside port city. All stacked and smushed together like sediment at the mouth of the Mississippi. The city was founded by the French in 1718, later governed by the Spanish, shaped profoundly by enslaved Africans, influenced heavily by Haitian refugees after the Haitian Revolution, and built upon land already known deeply by indigenous peoples long before Europeans arrived. And throughout its rich history, New Orleans remains proud of the way that the melting pot blended into one very unique culture. The result is a city where Catholic saints stand beside ancestor altars, where jazz funerals move through streets built for colonial empires, where French architecture shades Caribbean courtyards, where African spiritual traditions survived beneath the surface of Christianity and reshaped the culture forever. Even the architecture reflects this layering. The wrought iron balconies, hidden courtyards, and shotgun houses all bedecked in bright colors edged with mold and grit. New Orleans is beautiful, but it is a beauty constantly being reclaimed by the heat, the rain, the vines, by rust, and especially by time, all adding to the potent energy of aliveness that touches every single inch of the city. Now, inevitably, when people imagine New Orleans, many picture Bourbon Street. Neon signs and hurricanes in plastic cups, tourists spilling from bar to bar, and music blasting through open doors until 3 in the morning. And Bourbon Street is an experience, for sure, but it's not the whole city. In fact, one of the strangest things about New Orleans is how quickly the atmosphere changes when you step just a few streets away from the tourist corridors. Suddenly, you get quiet courtyards and old fountains and cats sleeping in windows. You see locals sitting on stoops beneath hanging ferns and candles flickering in street shrines to saints. There are parts of the French Quarter at night that feel less like a city and more like a dream that someone had centuries ago and never fully woke from. And I think it's important to say this here. New Orleans is often romanticized by outsiders in ways that completely flatten the people who actually live there. New Orleans is a wonderful city, But it's not an aesthetic. It's a very real place, filled with very real communities, many of whom have spent generations preserving traditions, all while surviving poverty, hurricanes, displacement, and tourism economies that often consume the culture without protecting the people who created it. And yet, despite all of that, the city's spirit remains astonishingly resilient. In fact, there are very few places in America where spiritual life feels as visible as it does in New Orleans. Candles in windows, offerings at graves, saint statues in gardens, altars in shops, veves drawn quietly in ritual spaces, prayer cards tucked into mirrors, or a gree-gree bag hanging from a belt loop, or any other number of things that range from overt to subtle. It's in residential neighborhoods, local cafes, and the tried and true tourist routes. Energy just oozes from every crack, whether intentionally spiritual or not. And much of this spiritual atmosphere emerges from syncretism, the blending of traditions. When enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to Louisiana, many carried spiritual systems that could not safely be practiced openly under colonial rule. And so, after generations, traditions eventually blended with Catholic imagery and ritual forms, creating a spiritual practice that survived through adaptation. This is part of why New Orleans spiritually often feels layered rather than divided. Saints become associated with spirits. Candles are both Catholic and magical, definitely multi-purpose. Prayer and ritual overlap, and unlike modern culture, which often separates the spiritual from ordinary life, New Orleans tends to weave them together. The sacred bleeds into the everyday here. A funeral procession may become a celebration. A meal may become a ritual. Music is prayer. In New Orleans, the boundary lines soften. As such, people often call New Orleans one of the most haunted cities in America, and certainly ghost stories cling to the city like humidity. If you walk the French Quarter long enough after midnight, eventually someone's going to point out the LaLaurie Mansion on Royal. Even if you know nothing else about New Orleans, you've probably heard this story, which was brought to popular attention with the American Horror Story Coven season. Madame Delphine LaLaurie was a wealthy socialite in the early 1800s, whose cruelty towards enslaved people became infamous after a fire exposed the horrifying abuse inside of her home. The details have grown tangled with rumor over the centuries, but the emotional weight of the story remains. People who have been inside the home for whatever reason report footsteps in empty halls, screams, figures at the upper windows, and whether one believes in ghosts or not, the building really does carry something heavy. Really terrible things happened there, and a kind of psychic scar is absolutely left behind from such cruelty. I have personally been there, and I'm very sensitive, and it is hard for me to even look at pictures of this place. So it was very hard for me to actually go lay hands on the front door of this home, but I did it because I wanted to acknowledge the truth of it. And I'm glad I did, but it is really heavy energy, and understandably so. Then there is also the Sultan's Palace, a beautiful old building on Dauphin Street that is wrapped in one of the quarter's most dramatic legends. According to local lore, a wealthy man claiming to be a sultan arrived in New Orleans in the late 1800s with an entourage. Lavish parties followed, and one morning the entire household was discovered brutally murdered. Blood supposedly spilled through the halls, while neighbors whispered about revenge, jealousy, or darker things entirely. Vampires. If you've ever read Anne Rice, or if you've seen the newest Interview with a Vampire series, this is what she's playing off of with Lestat and Louis and Claudia. And that's all I'm going to say, because I don't want to spoil anything for people, because I know it is picking up in popularity right now, as it should. Historians debate the truth of this story, but like so many New Orleans hauntings, the facts almost matter less than the atmosphere that the story leaves behind. The building still sits there, quietly, beneath balconies and shuttered windows, while tour guides lower their voices as they pass. And if you keep going, eventually you will reach the Ursuline Convent, where stories of nuns guarding hidden evils and attics that were never meant to be opened still haunt the minds of people that are brand new to the city or who have lived there their whole lives. One of the oldest surviving buildings along the Mississippi Valley is the Ursuline Convent, and it has accumulated centuries of folklore around it. Some tales claim that the shutters of the upper floor were once sealed shut with nails blessed by the Pope himself to imprison something unholy that was brought over from Europe. What this was varies, but the most famous story is that of the Casket Girls, where it's said that on one dark night, caskets were brought upriver under the cover of darkness. And within these caskets were young girls, young vampires brought to the convent for safekeeping, but who eventually did escape the convent and made root, forming the coven that would become New Orleans' vampire population that still resides in the city today. If someone has not turned that into a fiction novel, they need to, because that is a ripe story for the pickin'. And this story is almost certainly fiction. Almost certainly. Yet it does persist, because New Orleans has always been a city where Catholic imagery and the supernatural imagination blur together beautifully. Another popular favorite ghost story from New Orleans, particularly in the French Quarter, are the phantom musicians. Jazz, perhaps more than anything else, haunts New Orleans in the best possible way. People speak of hearing trumpets echoing through empty streets after clubs have closed, of shadowy brass bands glimpsed at impossible hours before disappearing just around the corner. There are stories of pianists still playing in old bars long after their death and long after the bar has closed. And honestly, in a city where music is woven so deeply into its identity, it almost feels stranger that the music would ever stop. Even the Mississippi River has its ghosts. The Mississippi carried unimaginable wealth through New Orleans. But, like I said, it also brought disease, slavery, war, and death. steamboat disasters, drownings, hurricanes, and yellow fever outbreaks. The river remembers it all. Some people say that you don't want to get stuck in the fog that rolls off the water at night, because that fog feels strange. That fog, it's said, carries the memories that the river carries and can put that heaviness into the body. And it's not a heaviness that's easily shaken. And that's understandable. New Orleans has faced some seriously vast trauma. But I think New Orleans feels haunted for a deeper reason. The city lives in close relationship with memory. Very little is erased completely here. New Orleans' history is still at the fingertips of all who wander its streets. The dead remain visible in above-ground cemeteries. Old architecture remains standing, often patched over instead of rebuilt. And music carries ancestral memory through rhythm and tradition. Even grief is public in New Orleans, especially with jazz funerals where mourning and celebration walk side by side throughout the streets. And perhaps that closeness to history and memory creates the feeling that people describe as haunting or heavy. With the sheer amount of accumulated presence and energy that fuels a lingering sense that stays with you long after the city is in the rear view, moments in New Orleans don't seem to ever really end. It's almost like in a city as old, humid, emotional, and layered as New Orleans, the rules of time don't exist the same way that they do in other places. Past midnight, the French Quarter changes. The heat softens just a bit. Street sweepers move slowly through nearly empty roads, and music drifts from distant bars in fragments now instead of waves. Somewhere a trumpet still plays, and the river still moves in darkness just beyond the levee. And if you walk long enough through the quarter at night, eventually you will begin to understand something. New Orleans loves to display life's complements. Joy beside grief. Beauty beside decay. Life beside death. And I think that's what feels the most magical for me. New Orleans teaches you to pay attention. That's why people fall in love with this city so deeply. New Orleans reminds us that the toxic individuality of modern society is deeply flawed. The sacred and the ordinary, the beautiful and the broken, the living and the dead, here in New Orleans, they dance together in the streets. That's all I have for you on this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, my dear listener, my name is Wishamaya. Don't forget to keep your roots deep and your dreams wild.